June 29th meeting of the OBGMA at 3:03. I'm going to call the roll, please.
Jim Finch,
Here.
Director Daddy,
Here.
Director Filkey,
Here.
Director Hayes.
Here. Okay, Stan.
Andrew Whitman is
Absent.
absent.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
And
To the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God, indivisible,
indivisible,
with liberty and justice for all. Okay, director comments. Peter.
Nothing today.
Bob.
Nothing for the city.
Jim.
We had a meeting trying to get caught up on a few things, and we're having a conference call, two of us with the LAFCO people, trying to still work through that.
Okay. I don't have anything from Casitas, but I'd like to welcome Cece back. Appreciate her jumping in and catching up.
Thank you.
General manager comments.
Okay, now I'm on. Like you mentioned, we brought CC back on board to help get all caught up. We also have Tara Ransom, who's working on the database, getting that caught up to date, responding to requests for previous statements and things like that. And they'll be working on getting the next quarterly statements out early next week. Or tomorrow even. So that is moving along fantastically. You can see I left some other papers in front of you besides the agenda. There's the Form 700s that need to be filled out. We just keep those on file. We don't submit them to the county. So when you get them filled out, hopefully in the next week or two, you can either, work with CC to get them over to the office or something like that, scan them even if you have to, and email them to the AOL. But like I said, we'll just keep those on file in the OBGMA office.
And, excuse me,
Go ahead.
office hours,
Oh, yes.
Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 12 to 3.
Office hours, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 12 to 3. You also have the banking form. We did pass a resolution last time for the new signatories. So each of you is responsible, if you haven't already, to fill that out, take it over to the Bank of Sierra with a copy of your driver's license. They'll make a copy of it there for you. And then we can get all of the banking stuff squared away for check signing, things like that.
And Julia, I might add, you might want to wait a week because they don't have the signature card that we need. I filled mine out. So if you're running and give it to them, you'll be coming back when they get the signature card ready.
Oh, they told me that form was all that they needed.
Well, when I went in, I filled out that form and they said, we'll call you back for the
Okay.
signature card. I said, okay.
Can I ask you who you spoke with?
Well, I want to say Alice. Is that correct?
There's a Lori and a
Lori.
Mary.
Who's the little girl in the back corner?
Lori.
Dark hair. That's Lori.
It should be Lori, yeah.
Yeah.
That was all she gave me was that form, so that's odd.
Do you mind if I call
Go
tomorrow?
call.
Yeah,
Okay.
call and clarify.
Just to make sure,
Yeah.
and I'll email you.
Was the resolution we passed acceptable?
Yes. Yes. And they have the original. I followed up with the Resource Conservation District on the grant. There was an invoice outstanding for reimbursement, like $11,000. They finally got their payment from it, so they'll be cutting us a check next week to close out that grant. I did submit the state controller's report for 2022 compensation. That got taken care of. I did go to that Sigma conference that you guys approved, and it was honestly one of the best conferences I've ever been to. Which sounds weird, I know I'm a nerd about water stuff, but there was a lot of, it was focused on Sigma. They did mention that Aqua has a Sigma subcommittee. There's a groundwater committee and then a Sigma subcommittee. So I'm trying to figure out how to get on the mailing list for that subcommittee, just to, again, expand our network on how other agencies are implementing Sigma and what kind of issues they run into. One statement that I thought was really interesting that they said, coming from DWR, was that grants are not going to fund sustainability. So we have to make sure that OBGMA understands and our pumpers understand we have to fund this stuff ourselves and not rely on grants. We can certainly pursue grants, but we can't count on them. So I set up a meeting with Jordan and Trevor, and it's a couple weeks out, maybe 3 weeks out, to go through the GSP and prioritize what projects and plans we should think about implementing over the next year or 2 years, what the budgets for them need to be, if we're going to bring in enough GSP fee money to support those. So we kind of have to go make a timeline for how we're going to implement it. So when we get there, I'll present that to you guys and get your feedback on it. They also did mention that when people are not paying their fees or their penalties, we can use property tax bills as an avenue to get payment back from whoever's delinquent. So just a few things that came up out of that conference. DWR also has a toolkit that talks about different fees, the regulatory technical assistance that they offer. They did say that a lot of the GSPs I've seen have been deficient in looking at the surface water groundwater interaction. So that might be a thing if we need to address at some point. But again, haven't seen any feedback from DWR yet. On ours, yeah. Let's see, what else? I think that was everything I had. Any questions?
State Church changed its mind on a year ago. They were telling us, make sure you apply. We've got lots of money.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that'll be a big revision, won't it?
Yeah.
We had a giant wish list. We
Yep.
actually had some things that were necessary.
Okay, Jordan, Basin report.
Okay, very good. Let me share the screen here. Okay, can everyone see this on the screen there? Looks like it in the corner?
Yes,
All right. And the audio is okay from this end?
yes.
Okay, thank you. Today I wanted to talk about June conditions, which are ironically dry as a bone, yet wet as a fountain. And as we go through this, you've probably seen what we're dealing with, but this is a good opportunity to share this. Obviously, year to date, rainfall totals pretty high, over 70 on the ridge and over 40 on the valley floor. That 41.43 inches on the valley floor to date isn't even top 6 in the historic past century and a quarter. We think of how wet this has been. Oh, it's the wettest ever. Well, maybe in some places, maybe at some times, and maybe at some short intervals, but again, haven't even cracked the top 6. Some of the ones in recent memory, obviously 2004, 2005, 82, 83, we all remember, 77, 78, we all remember, 97, 98, we all remember, and maybe a couple of you remember 68, 69, and 40, 41, probably not. But those are the big top ones, and they correlate pretty well with high amounts of storage within the basin. But it really just reflects to how responsive the basin is to precipitation and dependent upon it. So how has the basin responded? We had surface water flow continuously from late December through late January. Went pretty dry-ish in February until the 24th. The basin likely was full with a peak on April 13th in some places. And what we've realized is that some places kept rising. Some wells' water levels kept coming up as recently as June 23rd, and we'll talk a bit more about that. So we're at or near historic high water levels, at least for the Key Well area in the central portion of the basin. What was interesting is that all of the streams broke their continuous flow by mid-June. We made a reconnaissance on the 15th of June. We're kind of surprised to see that San Antonio Creek was no longer flowing continuously across the basin. But yet, some wells continue to flow artesian to this day here at the end of June. You'll see the one at Boardman Road. There's a couple of others around town that are flowing artesian, including our own depth discrete monitoring well. One of the 4 casings is flowing artesian. The other thing we're dealing with is a good amount of nuisance water. Folks are still calling us with issues of flooding basements and water springing into their foundations, which is a concern, but also something that is clearly connected to the shallowest aquifer system, which is still under pressure in those places. How does a well respond to that kind of pressure? Here's the Lago Marcino curve. This is just from March to late May, and on the x-axis, the y-axis is about 30 feet of water level. Red being water level, red being temperature, blue being water level, and ground surface being right around there. So it actually was flowing artesian with a little bit of an inflection when it became artesian pressure-wise. And as that was released, it kind of slowly receded, but then sort of reached that plateau toward the end of April and beginning of May before continuing the more normal sized recession. At the Key Well this week, and kind of an interesting artistic photograph here that Tim took. When you take a photograph by a water supply well, it's called a Welfie. But in this case, he's targeting the curves at the Elrod well, and you see a similar curve to that, sort of that gradual rise. This is just since April, to the peak in mid-April, and then a recession, but a stair-step recession, and that is often indicative of a threshold being met or reached or crossed. And in this case, it's most likely some kind of a clay stratum or something that is allowing water to go around it or through it, but affecting the deeper water system, since at some point upstream within the basin, you have a degree of that connectivity that's short-lived, and this is an example of why. On the long-term hydrograph, we've got the peak there at the 12th of April. As of yesterday, water level there was about 51.05 feet in that Elrod well. We call that about 96% of capacity, or 76,800 acre feet, assuming an 80,000 acre foot basin storage capacity. But what's interesting about this curve, as every time I look at it, I see something new. But what we notice is that for each of those peak years, and that's why I brought up the top 6, 2005, 1998, 1978, 1969. Some of those all had pretty high groundwater levels, but they all had a pretty quick recession. Now, by recession, I mean drop from the peak to the nadir. And the question would be, why does that happen? Why does the water level drop so much more in really wet years than the drier years? And the hypothesis is a couple fold, but one, we're probably pumping more groundwater when it's available. And two, if there is any kind of connectivity in the headwaters area or in the upper portion of the basin where the main aquifer system water goes around a pinching point of a clay stratum and feeds the perching layer, then some of that would be allowed to escape. So another reason why we're exploring, especially in this meeting, some of the characteristics of the perch system. So inflow as of yesterday's reconnaissance, Gridley was flowing in at 1.85 CFS, Senior 2.44, Thatcher 1.25, Reeves about a half CFS. The surface flow out at Montgomery under Creek Road was about 3/4 of a CFS. We had over 20 at San Antonio Creek proper and about 1.5 coming in at the Stewart and Fox area over town. Now, this is an interesting characteristic. We appear to have all of this flow coming in that totals around 7.5 CFS. And of course, that's what we're measuring at ground surface. There's certainly alluvium underneath many of these creeks at the points of measurement, and there is alluvium upstream of them as well. So I would say that the recharge is greater than 7.5 CFS. But now that the creeks are discontinuous, when we see that surface water outflow of 21 CFS, it has to be attributed to something. Number one, I think there's artesian wells, nuisance waters, as I mentioned, the basement flooding issues, and of course the perch system. So we really want to sink our teeth into what that means and why. And one of the best tools we have is, of course, the network of wells that are screened and sealed within the perch system itself. Now, this is the hydrograph for the perched well at our depth discrete monitoring well in South Fulton Street. Now, we've got about basically 2 years of data now almost, and we've got this great water year of 2022, 2023, where from nadir to today, we have 11 feet of rise in that perch system. This is only a 24-foot deep system at that location. And it varies throughout that portion of the basin. But if we have 11 feet of saturated thickness, the delta from dry to wet this year, and it extends about 4 square miles, that's 2,560 acres. If you do a little bit of math on that, I get 11 feet of thickness and an assumed effective porosity of 25%. That's over 7,000 acre feet in storage within that perch system, just with what we have wet now to dry back in November 2022. So what does that mean? If that 20 CFS is coming from that, how much water is that? Well, that's about 40 acre feet per day. And that 7,000 acre feet in storage would release to San Antonio Creek over about 173 days at that rate. The other thing we notice about this graph is that there's that pretty consistent recession, that downward slope to the right in this water level graph that shows how water is leaving that perch system and going somewhere, San Antonio Creek. Now, when the water level is 11 feet above its low, it certainly has a higher driver and you're going to have more flow coming out of it. So that 20 CFS, as we've seen over the past few months at least, it was 30 CFS this time last month. It's 20 CFS today. Will it be 15 next month or 10 or less than 10? We have to measure to find out. But it certainly would correlate that recession of flow to the recession in water levels here at this and other perch system wells. Now, the main aquifer at that location didn't hit its peak until June 23rd. And that's some 2.5 months after what happened in the central portion of the basin. This elevation is a little bit lower, but it certainly is downstream of the pumping depression in the major production area of the basin. So it stands to reason that that deeper depression fills first, and then the wave hits this portion of the basin much later, 2.5 months later. Now, again, a tour of yesterday's hydrology. We still have the artesian wells flowing at Boardman. That's the wet as a fountain portion. Now, San Antonio Creek, it's getting pretty filled with algae, and in some places, it's dry. In fact, it's dry now just downstream from Grand and just upstream to Fordyce. This is how it looks dry as a bone. Up near the place where it enters the basin, the confluence of Senior Canyon and Gridley, you still have a good amount of flow. It's, all that total 4 plus or minus CFS. Thatcher Creek trickling in under McAndrew. Reeves Creek entering the basin, only about half a CFS. But the dry, discontinuous portion, dry at Thatcher and the Reeves confluence. Now, the first flow that we see is just downstream from Grand Avenue in San Antonio Creek. This is where that perched water is coming back to the surface. And the south edge of San Antonio Creek flow on the north side. So this is the leading edge of flow where it fully infiltrates into the basin. And so there's this mile of dry San Antonio Creek between Fordyce and Grand. Down on the discharge side, pretty slow flowing water out of the Montgomery or Stewart Creek under Creek Road, only 3/4 of a CFS, which is pretty slow for how deep that channel is. There's a lot of sediment in there and buildup on the downstream side too, impeding that flow. Where the main portion of San Antonio Creek's exiting the basin, this is where we get that 20 CFS as measured yesterday in that beautiful photograph that Tim took. Down closer to the Ventura River, this is the Old Creek Road bridge. Now, what's interesting here, the county website puts an observation of 232 CFS at this location, but it, at the same token, models a prediction of 14 CFS. We think the actual is probably closer to 24. Now, you'll note there that there's a lot of alluvium and often almost looks like there's a channel to the west. This is a south view from that bridge with the radar gauge just right there to the left, lower left of this image. So that 24 CFS is a visual estimate, probably includes some underflow to that alluvium as well. And finally, when we get to the confluence of the Ventura River, it's looking like a pretty verdant, certainly early summer time frame. On the bigger screen time frame, this hydrologic curve that we've put together really shows what we've got as far as the input hydrology and the output. What I'll call to your attention today is that orange curve at the bottom is the main aquifer system at the Depta Street monitoring well, still rising up to June 23rd, whereas almost every other component of the system is going downward. It's receding. It's going, water levels are declining and have been for some time. Surface water is discontinuous, and the surface water flow is declining as well. But we still don't have all of the data from 2023 water year available from the county for San Antonio Creek at Old Creek Road Bridge. But as you can see, we've got our work cut out for us to really pin this down and be prepared to answer the questions, as Julia mentioned, answering the questions about surface water interface. And these kind of data are imperative to show that we're doing that work and that we can draw some conclusions about that connectivity and how it can best be managed. Questions?
Any questions?
On San Antonio, I think the cement weir notch is forcing the water underground, Jordan.
At Grand,
At Grand, yeah, the notch that's supposed to measure it for the spreading grounds. I think.
right. And I would think that could be a potential if it were just localized, but because it goes a mile upstream is dry, so any flows there is underground and probably reaching the main system as it infiltrates down by Fordyce. But that whole mile is absent surface water. So I think you might be right if that was the case on some of the early desiccation, maybe earliest June. But by June 15th, when we made the reconnaissance, it was a much longer reach of dry conditions along San Antonio Creek there.
They need an upside down notch to make sure it's underground.
Right.
Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, comment. Excellent report. Thank you very much. This is slowly starting to fill in all the little fragments for the whole basin and make sense. So thanks.
It's good. It's a long process, and we're not done. That's for sure.
Hey, thank you, Jordan.
The
All right.
only thing I wanted to mention is that Jordan and Trevor are coordinating on getting the quarterly report done. That needs to be submitted, I think by July 1st, right? Trevor, hate to put you on the spot.
Yeah, that's correct. It's and it's just a groundwater level upload. So Jordan and I are coordinating to get that data uploaded to TWR.
Thanks.
Okay. For the record, Director Andy Whitman is here. Are there any public comments on any items not on today's agenda? Okay. Next item is the consent agenda. We're slowly catching up on our meeting minutes, and the financial report is in that item. Are there any comments or questions on any of those items? Hearing none, can I have a motion?
Move.
Call the roll.
Director Kelly?
Yes.
Director Finch?
Yes.
Director Daddy?
Yes.
Director Whitman?
Yes.
Chair.
Chair.
Oh,
Pages.
yes. Okay, the next item is well verification application. Julia?
Hi, so we talked about this at the last meeting, just updating that well verification, or what we called previously the well permit application, so that we're in compliance with the executive orders. I need to make a couple modifications still, but I wanted to go through those with you and with Peter's input, so we can get this in place. One of the changes is to call it, instead of just water well verification request, that we call it water well registration and verification request. And then I didn't realize that the general information got cut off, and there's part of that last sentence is missing. So I need to expand that and include it. I apologize for that. And then on the second page, the bottom portion that says well verification for OBGMA use only, Peter suggested that we just call it for agency use only, because it goes to the county. This is something that the county sees, and if we just say agency, it's a little more generic, I guess. Expansive. And expansive, so were those the only changes that we discussed?
Those were the only ones that we discussed, yes.
Okay. So I'm open to more feedback.
So I had a thought reading the first part with the general information, that's a really good statement that a well owner's got obligations, and it would be, I don't know how this fits in, but if you potentially make it clear that they're acknowledging that these obligations exist, initial it or sign under that, or I don't know if there's a right way just to do that connection. So I'm not suggesting really change anything other than to, I know when I fill out forms, a lot of times I kind of glance past the general information or instructions and
You don't
pay a
read the
lot
terms
more,
and conditions?
pay a lot more attention when they're making me sign that. So that's my only comment.
Maybe something on item I, where the applicant's signature is, we add some little statement like, I acknowledge the responsibilities of or something.
Yeah, I mean, we
can come up with
something certainly.
But you're signing,
Well, you could do it like you do online, you have a box, and you gotta check that box.
Yeah,
before you go to
initials
the
even,
next.
or,
Yeah.
yeah. Initials, just to acknowledge that, just an acknowledgement that you've read it, I guess, is what I'm
Yeah,
looking at. Because I just envision the only time this is gonna be a problem is when somebody's not gonna do what they're obligated to do, and then they're gonna say, well, I didn't understand that from that. It just a little, maybe just a little extra layer of, being able to say, well, you signed, you initialed it, or.
She signed the permit.
Sure, we can create something like that, if I understand correctly, by signing or acknowledging a willingness to comply with the agency rules and regulations, something to that effect.
I
and
think that's
everything-
perfect, yeah.
And everything in this application is true and correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then on the flow chart, I think the only change we wanted to make was for replacement well, in that box, say replacement well with same capacity as existing, or something like that. Because then it would be exempt from the executive order. So I can make that change as well. Okay, any other comments or feedback?
Yep, I have a comment. Wow. I encountered an issue with a local resident on a well, and it had to do with metering. And we're not asking for meter readings if they're changing, kind of like an odometer when you change a car. You know, you got a reading or you don't have a reading. And not everybody has meters. We don't ask if they're gonna have meters.
No, it says all wells must have a meter.
Well, I know that's what it says there, but when we take a look at the new type of well, shouldn't we put in everything that we need with the meters? What the reading was before, what kind of meter they're gonna put in? Because we have replacement wells that don't have meters at this time. Anyhow, that's just a thought, because we have discovered over the last 6 months that some people thought that if you used a little, you didn't pay, and if you used a little, you didn't report it. And a number of people thought, well, de minimis meant no meter, and so it's almost easier just to establish that, yeah, you're gonna have to have a meter. We're gonna keep track of the meter, and you're gonna have to report.
And that is part of the agency's rules and regulations, so I think it's a good idea by creating this box as suggested and saying, and attesting to, acknowledging and your willingness to comply. This is something that theoretically we could, say you agreed to this, right, when you applied for your well.
And I just think that we need to actually specify meters so they know it's a requirement. They're saying that they're gonna play by all the rules. Let's put some things down that let them know what all the rules are.
Do you mean a specific type of meter, or just
I
any?
think that would be fine. I think meter readings would be fine. Something to make them aware.
So, take a look at the second sentence in the general information and just tell me if you believe that satisfies this. No extraction facility may be operated or otherwise utilized so as to extract groundwater within the boundaries of the agency unless the facility is registered with the agency, equipped with a water meter, and all extractions are reported to the agency as required by OBGMA ordinance number 8.
If you're happy and we can track it, I'm fine.
I think where the issue is that you're raising is in tracking and enforcement. We can say
Yeah.
this is a requirement, but, we need to make sure that everybody actually does in fact have a meeting and is reporting.
Yeah, this isn't, wells are not gonna get 1% of the people. If we wanna do something, we just should do that in regards to reporting. And as much as I hate it, United went to pictures with every report, and I would not advocate that. pictures once a year or every other would, I think, once a year are plenty, but that way you get the meter number. You see that it's the same meter and the readings, because it's just like an Edison meter. It used to be able to misread one time and it would catch up the next time.
Yeah. Yes,
A lot of people don't know how to read their meters.
yes.
And they don't know how to pay their
Yeah,
bills.
when we get the statements back, their math is all wrong. They don't understand, like, the units are different and there are errors.
And that is one thing the picture once a year would help with, because it shows acre feet, gallons,
Right.
hundreds,
CFS, right.
hundreds, CFS, whatever, or C.
That could be another thing we look at, implementing, and then, I don't know if that needs to be an ordinance or an update to an ordinance.
We should
Some kind.
probably amend the metering ordinance to include that requirement if we were gonna do that, yeah.
Okay.
When someone constructs a replacement well, is there a requirement by the county that the old well be destroyed?
Yeah.
I would have to check. I don't know offhand, or if sometimes a replacement well just means they're digging, it could be the same well but deeper. Or
Yeah.
it could be a completely different well in a different location. Sometimes they just go inactive, not necessarily destroyed. So it could be a combination of things.
Wouldn't that come under the health department? I know I read some of our minutes about 12 years ago. OBGMA, I don't know why, but there was a discussion that it came under the auspices of the health department to properly close and seal
I think-
wells that were no longer in use to keep from contamination.
But you can pump it 8 hours a year, and it's maintained.
And then sometimes they call them a standby.
Yeah. So that you can make a case.
Okay.
Yeah, oftentimes folks will keep the wells they're replacing as a backup. That's the most common thing we see countywide, that it allows people to maintain that activity but not use their primary source and save on the expense of destruction.
Okay. One thing for our information, there's 2 bills pending. I think they're sponsored by Assemblymember Bennett, that are basically they're somewhat redundant. Each bill seems redundant, but it appears that what he's trying to do is make the governor's executive order permanent, which I just briefly read the bills, but it looks like we would be in compliance anyway, so there may be some tweaks we have to do to it, but I don't think so.
Is that our Supervisor Bennett?
Yes,
Who spoke on that?
Assemblyman Bennett, yes.
Assembly.
Assemblyman, sorry.
He's moved up.
Yep.
Yeah, turned out. Okay. So any further questions or comments on that? This is an action item, so we could have a motion to approve as amended
Motion to approve.
Second?
and call the roll.
Director Felke?
Yes.
Director Finch?
Yes.
Director Daddy?
Yes.
Director Whitman?
Yes?
Chair Aegis?
Yes. The next item is a discussion item on the perch groundwater ordinance.
Yeah, I don't have anything prepared. There's nothing attached to your agenda, but this is something that had come up previously on establishing, as, Jordan's been talking about that quite a bit in his presentation this time, about the perch zone and how we don't want to have any wells, in that zone. We want to protect it and not have that surface water, groundwater interaction. So I'm basically opening it up for discussion to see how the board feels about adopting a formal ordinance and what that would include, and certainly get Jordan's input on it as well, and Trevor, if he's interested.
We have perch water wells, and I've issued them in the city. And what is the reason we don't want to have them? I'm not for or against, I'm just saying, I need explanation.
Want to speak to that?
Sure. Yeah. The issue of wells that extract groundwater or could potentially extract groundwater from the perch system is that is the one that is most directly connected to San Antonio Creek within the basin. And if a well is extracting from that system, it's not going into San Antonio Creek, whereas the main portion of the basin is more isolated. So the idea would be that any new wells that are drilled aerially within what we define as the perched aquifer system, or alternatively known as the southwestern uppermost saturated zone. But for those that are dealing with remediation of contamination, or are for monitoring, or are for addressing nuisance water, that is, a sump pump that's keeping the skate park dry, that kind of thing. We'd want to make sure that it's not interfering with that surface water, and it's a way that we recognize that there is that connection, and that this is the primary means of connection, and that by drafting and adopting an ordinance that prevents new wells from targeting that zone, that it allows that water to go into San Antonio Creek, and therefore protect the habitat, and put at the top of the list of our GSP implementation how we're going to, by ordinance, minimize the effects or undesirable results of surface water depletion.
Question?
Oh, yeah.
Would it be reasonable to have an expectation for dewatering for a limit? So if we put a limit at 6 or 8 or 10 feet for the perched, or 5 feet just to lower groundwater in a certain area where you do have the basement. I know I put the one in at the skate park. I know that we have a couple of other ones on Bryant Street. And as long as they're not, 30, 40, 50 feet deep, I would think that it would be reasonable for maybe 4 or 5 feet or 3 feet, just to keep the artesianing and the surface from being saturated all the time. So I don't know if that's feasible.
I think it's feasible. I think it's a good idea. And the benefit of a dewatering well is that you're not taking water out of the perch system or diverting it out of San Antonio Creek and making it go nowhere. You're actually taking that water out of the perch system and probably discharging it to a surface water gutter or storm drain, and it just is going to find its way there a little sooner. So you're not depleting the resource without repleting that resource. So I think by that means of argument, that we could say a dewatering well, as I mentioned earlier, in said ordinance, would allow us that condition to exist. And, same for remediation. If there's a contamination spill and somebody needs to pump groundwater to prevent contamination from going downstream or staying in the system, they would need to extract that groundwater as well, and likely treat it, and also likely discharge it to a surface water receptor.
Do we know if there's any existing production wells in that zone?
I don't know of any that are exclusively extracting groundwater from the southwestern uppermost saturated zone or perch system.
And these wells would be extraction wells for consumptive use purposes, right?
That's what we would seek to forbear. Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, we'd write this, and it'd have to be craftily worded, Peter. I'm looking at you for your wordsmithing on this, and Julia, of course, too. But the idea would be that we'd make something that's compliant, that meets the letter of Sigma, to avoid the undesirable results. And, you know, if the DWR were to come back and say, hey, your GSP is not strong enough on the surface water groundwater connection, we have this ordinance that we can say, we just passed this, it addresses these conditions, and here are the exceptions, and here is the rule, and here's why. And these are all the data we have, and this is, because, you know, failing that, you know, we're looking at ways to recharge that system, to maintain creek flow, or otherwise divert or store water, then release it later via that same system. But by putting an ordinance together that does this over the basin, it does wonders for compliance with Sigma and our GSP.
Jim?
I would think that you could just do the ordinance with a little wording for exceptions granted by the board for that. Because most of the other things, the French drain type system, the skate park system, those aren't drilled wells. Those are just dug. You're never going to get a permit application on that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, we deal with, especially now in our business, a lot of high groundwater issues. And who do you even ask for a permit to put a sump in the ground or dig a hole and put a sump pump in it? And I mean, because you're not going to get an environmental health permit from the county because you can't put a 25-foot seal in it. It's not always going to be wet. You know, it certainly is something that, you know, I think the OBGMA could be aware of. You know, do some kind of studying for demonstrate compliance with this kind of ordinance. But as far as, you know, extraction wells that it would be for consumptive use, as Peter said, that's what we want to target as being, if there's going to be a production well drilled within the aerial footprint of that it has a seal out through the base of the confining layer.
Yeah, and you can't discharge to surface water without a permit, so that's another complication. So if you actually
Right.
pumped it and tried to discharge it, you wouldn't be able to do it.
Without a NPDES type permit
Yeah.
or blanket permit that another agency or entity would issue.
Yeah. Andy?
Yeah, I don't know that this interrelates, but you know, a year ago, Jordan can maybe speak better to this than I can, but you know, about a year ago, there were about 40 or 50 attorneys ready to go to trial over whether the perched aquifer connection to the rivers meant that there was a connection to the groundwater basin, meant that Ventura and the state could make a claim on our groundwater basin. And so I would want whatever we do in terms of an ordinance to be very clear that I know Jordan spent a lot of time in the work up to that trial explaining the difference between perched aquifer and the groundwater basin. But it was absolutely the most important issue that was going on in that case until they decided to mediate it. So we should treat the issue, you know, very carefully and thoughtfully with the idea that people are eventually going to be looking at the fact that we have some groundwater and wanting to make their claim against it.
Yeah, I think it's an important thing to do. I mean, it's probably the simplest action we can take in implementing our GSP. It is, I mean, this whole concept of this purge zone or whatever we want to call it, I mean, it's a fundamental part of the surface water, groundwater interconnection that we deal with in groundwater sustainability. So to me, we don't need a grant to do this, and we could show that we're taking some action. Just a like Andy said, we gotta be careful about how we craft it.
Yeah, I mean, I see this as a very proactive approach to implementing the GSP. It possibly could be done by board resolution, but an ordinance is probably a little more permanent and maybe a better demonstration of proactivity. Without any action, given the governor's executive order and the charge that the agency has to determine whether well applications are, consistent with the groundwater sustainability plan or somehow would not or impede, achievement of groundwater sustainability. I mean, the agency still has the ability to look at any sort of proposal to do a production well in the perched aquifer and say, no, it's not consistent with our groundwater sustainability plan. So the control is there, but this would be an additional extra step the agency could take if DWR ever came knocking and said, you're not doing enough to implement or deal with the interconnectivity issue. So it's something that if the board were to give direction, we could, try to come back with something for the board to review and think about. And I think Mr. Whitman's point's a very good one, that, you always need to be thinking about what's going on with the adjudication and how this might have implications broader than just, what we're trying to do here today, so.
So any disagreement that we take a shot at drafting something? Okay.
We'll work on that and bring something to the July meeting.
Yeah. Yes.
I didn't catch who seconded the well verification application.
I think I might have.
Yes, I think Andy did.
Thank you.
Okay, if there's no further discussion, no further questions, you have one?
Well, I have one comment based on Julia's report of don't be thinking about grants and following a very wet winter, spring. I don't think our receipts are going to be huge in this quarter concluding tomorrow. We'll probably have good receipts for the next quarter. But because in the old form, we're statutorily limited at $50, I think. But in the new, given the Sigma, we have rights. Do we feel we have the ability to go to where we need to?
I think we have the authority.
Yeah.
We can increase, I understand, we can increase the wellhead fee without approval of the legislature. And we can increase the fee related to Sigma without that.
And that's really where all the costs are.
Yes.
Okay.
I'd like to look at the wellhead fee, as it may flush out some of these wells that are inactive and should be destroyed. Any other comments?
Yeah, with that, to end on that, we had quite a litany of wish lists, and there was a lot of grant money that we didn't get.
Yes.
And there were some items that were pretty big ticket items. Shouldn't we prioritize those as quickly as we can? And
That's what Julia offered to do.
we're gonna have, okay, and then we'll know
Yes.
what kind of deficit spending we're looking at.
Yeah, that I'm gonna meet with Jordan and Trevor in a couple weeks to go through and the projects, estimated budget for them, and then come up with a prioritization and a timeline.
Okay?
I mean, I just don't want to see this thing go crazy on wellhead fees and extraction fees, and I'm just, what I think about rates
Yeah.
and cost and the price of water, and if we've got a long trajectory on this, we better start now, and we better make it a slow incline.
Yes.
United went up $35, I think, this year. An acre foot. And they presented a 10-year budget of $700 million.
Ouch. That sounds like they need to apply for some grants. Or
I mean,
loans,
it
or
pretty much
bonds.
will just stop water usage, just on the fees.
Didn't the LGA go up to 50?
I don't know.
Well, we're gonna have to tackle that, so, not today. If there's nothing else, we're adjourned at 4 o'clock.